build on our knowledge of what was going on in Georgia and South Carolina with our next speaker. Dr. Michael Morris actually is from this area originally. He is now a full professor at Georgia Coastal here.
Brunswick, St. Simons.
St. Simons, yeah. And recently was the president of the Georgia Association of Historians. Michael is one of those remarkable people that manages to teach a full load and also do incredible research and writing. So let me tell you about his 3 books, and they are back there on the table. The one that he's going to be talking about today is George Galphin and the transformation of the Georgia South Carolina backcountry. Another is the bringing of wonder, trade and the Indians of the Southeast from 1700 to 1703, and Cherokee Odyssey, the journey from sovereign to civilized in quotation marks. A lot of his work has been on the southeastern Indians and their relationship to the people who colonized in the southeast. And so, without further ado, Dr. Michael Morris. Thank you, Michael. And by the way, his PhD is from Auburn University in Cary, Auburn,
War Eagle. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Leanne, for inviting me to be here today. And it's always a pleasure to look into an audience where everyone is not playing on their cell phone like my students will be on Monday morning. So thank you for that. I always come when Leanne calls. It's really important to do that. It's always a pleasure to be a part of things that she organizes. I had the rare pleasure of being both Ed Cashin's student and an employee of his. Ed Cashin was one of my professors at Augusta College. And he told me one time as an undergraduate, he said, you could spend the rest of your life studying the backcountry. And I thought that was so foolish. And now all these years later, he was more than right. You could spend lifetimes researching the backcountry. It is the key to understanding the South. Nothing happens in the South unless it has the support of the backcountry. So many memories of Ed. When I graduated from Auburn without a job, he made a temporary position for me at Augusta College. I didn't realize at the time, but he gave up part of one of his own classes so that I could teach my very first class back where I started. And it happened to be in the same room where I took my last class from him. So it was a really ironic, bittersweet journey. Ed is the most kind person I ever knew in higher ed. Sorry. His work stands on its own, but it affects so many other historians. And there was this incredible calmness about Ed. And I never saw him flapped by anything. He was just incredibly calm. Whenever he and Marianne would come to the Georgia history meetings, I would start looking for them the moment I got there, and I'd be sitting, and at some point in the opening session, they would appear and sneak in the back and sit down. And I would think, well, all is right with the world because they are here now. The only time I ever saw Ed a little flustered was coming up the stairwell one day. I was going up, he was coming down, and he said, oh, I just got your reference letter done and mailed off. And I said, Dr. Cashin, I haven't asked you for a reference letter. It was another Michael Morris that he had written the letter for and sent off. And he sort of fell back up against the wall and said, oh, my Lord. And I'm sure he took care of it that day. But that was the closest I ever saw of him being a little flustered. But many great memories, and it's great to see the Cashin family today. I got started in this business because I became fascinated in backcountry fur traders taking Indian wives. And they are in large part responsible for much of the history of the backcountry. These fur traders were backcountry diplomats, they were translators, they were also entrepreneurs trying to make an easy buck. It was the perfect occupation for people with low education to come into the southern colonies and get rich quick, but for a very short window between 1700 and 1750. George Galphin fits this story because he was the most influential of the southern fur traders. And like most of them, he took Indian wives, which may be shocking, I guess, to some people. No fur trader would ever be successful in the backcountry without an Indian wife, and that is true for either the Muskogee Creeks, who prefer the name Muskogee now, but if you've been around a while, they are the Creeks, and that's usually how I refer to them. Same for the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws. And so in taking Indian wives, Galphin was going to be participating in a very common pattern. He is also part of a pattern of, he came into the Southeast through the help of Scots-Irish already here. Once he got here, he turned around and helped other immigrants come into the Southeast. So there's very much a powerful network of them working to bring in other friends and family, get them established, and the Indian fur trade is the vehicle for that. He is going to, in his lifetime, sponsor 2 Scots-Irish immigrant communities, one in western South Carolina that we'll talk about in just a moment, one near the town of Louisville, Georgia, known as Queensboro. And if you ever pass a bank named Queensboro, that is partly named for the Scots-Irish community of Queensboro near Louisville. So when the bank changed its name, it did so partly to reflect the heritage of this Scots-Irish community near Louisville. So I wish I could offer you a portrait of George Galphin. To my knowledge, none exists, but I do have the Galphin descendants here with me today. Anybody? Any Mr. Mr. Murray is here. Yeah. So without further ado, let's get into the story of George Galphin. He was born in Northern Ireland in the cathedral city of Armagh, County Armagh, in 1709. And he was he was a member of a large family, 7 children born to Thomas and Barbara Galphin, linen weavers. And so this is the story. The Scots-Irish immigration is often what I call people leaving Northern Ireland to cross the linen lanes into the southern colonies. Large family, siblings Margaret, Judith, Susanna, Robert, Martha, and Barbara. These names of his siblings will be used for his children. And I will do sort of a spoiler alert and tell you he has a multiracial family. And so this is very much part of what we call the Creole Society of the South. Caucasian, Native American, African American. His early life is a bit of a mystery. 6 brothers and sisters. The family worked in the linen trade. And one of the problems in the early linen trade was a boom-bust cycle. So much variation in the profit margin, feast one year, famine the next year. And this is going to lead to a fairly large outmigration of people. About 250,000 Scots-Irish are going to leave in the period between 1700 and just before the Revolutionary War. There were 5 specific waves of immigrants between 1717 and 1775. And George came over between the 2nd and 3rd waves. Now, again, you may find this a little shocking, but he married at age 27 in December of 1736 and abandons this wife, Catherine Saunderson, the very next year. So a lot of the history of the fur traders, and I checked, there is an Ulster American Society that tracks this from Northern Ireland, and they actually have a copy of this book. I sent it to them the year it came out, so they have the George Galphin story on the other side of the Atlantic. But abandoning wives, according to the experts in Northern Ireland, was fairly common for these 250,000 men who come over. And of course, it will be women as well. But wife abandonment seems to be part of the pattern. Catherine Saunderson, as far as we know, was the only legal Mrs. Galphin that ever existed. But there will be 5 common law wives at the end of his life and career. He comes into South Carolina and begins work for the South Carolina government in the Indian trade in 1737. In just 8 short years later, he is listed as a preferred interpreter of the Creek language for the South Carolina government that tried to manage the fur trade. And the fur trade consisted of buying white-tailed deer skins. We like to think of cotton and rice as forming the economies of most southern colonies, but it's actually the deerskin trade. It is the deerskin trade that provided the startup economies. And so the tribes trade deerskins. In fact, some of them deplete their populations to get cotton cloth, metal tools, pots and pans, and guns and ammunition. Once the colonies have made peace treaties with the Indians, they will give them a certain amount of guns every year, a certain amount of ammunition, and we call those guns trade guns. They're designed to break down in a year or two. Why do you think the British are going to trade the Indians guns that are deliberately designed to last a year or two? Why? To get them coming back to the table to trade more. It's also a safety feature in case those tribes turn the guns against the colony. We know they won't last long. We know that when the guns break down, the tribes don't have the capability to repair them. And so this is part of the trade itself. Just so you know, George Galphin was semi-literate. And I use statements of his in the book as chapter titles. And my favorite is from his Revolutionary War service. This is how he wrote his desire to serve the patriot government. I should take a pleasure in serving my country. So semi-literate at best, but within 7 years of arriving, he is listed as a preferred translator for the Creek language. Now, wrap your brain around this. It has 8 dialects. And as we know, dialects are subtle differences in words in the language that mean different things. So he has mastered the Creek language enough to be a government employee for South Carolina government. This is one part of the Indian trade where the supplies are taken up to the tribes, usually to preferred trading towns, and you see some of the exchange values here. Guns equal 35 skins, a blanket is 16 skins. You would take a pack horse team of 50 to 100 horses or mules, loaded down with merchandise to sell, and then you bring the skins back out of the country. And most people involved, most of the Scots-Irish in the Indian trade started off as the pack horsemen. They were sort of the mules, loading up and unloading and then bringing the skins out of the back country. As far as the Scots-Irish, I'll tell a few tales about them. One of the reasons that so many of them will leave Northern Ireland is they get caught up in a process called rack renting. So they are leasing their lands, and these are long 10 and 20 and 25-year leases. It was customary for the landlord, when the lease was up, to jack up the price exponentially high so that your former tenant, who may have raised his entire family there, couldn't afford to stay. So rack renting, also along with the vagaries of the linen trade, will be why so many of them leave. But a few things about the Scots-Irish: they bring their sensibilities here with them. I love this quote about them: "Every man was as good as any other man. If someone thought they were better than anybody else, they had to prove it with their words or their deeds or their fists." So you've got to fight. And I'll remind us of our first Scots-Irish president, Andrew Jackson. One day, Andrew Jackson's mother caught the 3-year-old crying about something, and she told him to hush up that crying. Boys aren't made for crying. And so the naturally curious toddler said, "Well, what are they made for?" And she said, "Fighting." So other aspects to the Scots-Irish: they believed that every man was a sheriff on their own land. Once they got here and got their land, they were the law enforcement of it. They also believed they could flourish anywhere in the world, and especially in hostile environments. So the back countries of Georgia and South Carolina were perfect for them. They expected hardship. They expected adversity. And the funniest thing is, no Scots-Irish was ever satisfied until they had moved at least 3 times. The third time is where you're probably going to stay. One of the reasons they flourish in the Indian trade is they understand clan vengeance among the tribes because they come from that same clan system back home. And they had less prejudice against the tribes than Anglo-Saxon Brits. A lot of the scholarship on the Scots and these Scots-Irish now sort of focuses on them as the middle managers of the British Empire, who did sort of the middle level work of keeping the empire running. And the Indian fur trade is a perfect example of that. It is predominantly Scots-Irish. And as we said, they are helping each other into the business. The first major leap that George Galphin had was in 1750 when he joined the Augusta fur trading firm of Brown, Ray and Company, with Patrick Brown as the founder. John Ray was a secondary founder, and George Galphin was his assistant in the early years of the trade. Now, Brown, Ray and Company is their technical name. They prefer to be called the Gentlemen of Augusta. And they are a very powerful entity, as it turns out. The company employed 20 pack horsemen and owned 123 horses to transport merchandise in and out of the backcountry. And George Galphin will eventually be assigned to the Muskogee Creek town of Coweta, which is one of the mother or foundational towns of the Creek Confederacy. He will later become involved with a Creek diplomat named Handsome Fellow, who we must assume was handsome. And as it turns out, Handsome Fellow was his father-in-law of a Muskogee Creek wife. And so he is going to participate. As we said, no fur trader can advance in this career field without an Indian wife. I'm sure you guys could guess why. Why would a Scots-Irish fur trader need a Creek or a Cherokee wife? That's who they learn the language from. That's who they learn the customs from. And this may seem, huh? Absolutely. And for the tribes, for this kind of Scots-Irish fur trader to accept an Indian wife, in the tribe's mind, that means he has accepted the tribe. If he has accepted her, and what will be icing on the cake is when Anglo-Indian children are born. That is, these children become a sign or a symbol of the partnership between that fur trader and the tribe he serves. What does the Indian wife get out of it? Because we know now that most of the tribes thought the Europeans were a little ugly, not quite so handsome. They think their own men are better looking. So what would she get out of a fur trader husband? Material goods and security. And it becomes prestigious. It becomes prestigious to have this foreign husband. It becomes prestigious to have children that have your skin color but have blue or green eyes. It becomes prestigious within the tribe to have these Anglo-Indian children. So he rises up through the company, and very quickly he establishes himself as a tested and true diplomat translator for the South Carolina Indian government or the Indian trade, trying to manage everything that goes on in the backcountry. In 1761, George Galphin entered a new phase of his career when he became one of the, well, I should mention, I'm jumping around here. This is how the Scots-Irish come into the South. They come down the Great Wagon Road from Virginia. It actually starts up in Pennsylvania and comes and ends where? Ed told us long ago, Augusta was the center of the universe. He was right. They come down this long wagon road, and by the time the Scots-Irish come in, the coastal lands are pretty much taken up by first and second generation families. The land that is left open to them is the backcountry that backs up to the Appalachian Mountains. So it's no surprise that so many of them did settle there. And George Galphin actually had a part in that. In 1761, along with his partner and business partner and boss, John Ray, they petitioned the South Carolina government to create Scots-Irish communities in western South Carolina. They applied for a grant of 40,000 acres to be used. At the time, the original plan was for 2 townships, but it will ultimately expand to 4. And there were 8 partners in total bringing these settlers over. They wanted to bring from Charlestown groups of 40, up at least, no less than 40. They wanted nuclear families, extended families, to bring them up into western South Carolina. And the South Carolina Commons House of Assembly chose to appropriate the land and go through with the plans. And this is right after the Anglo-Cherokee War, which is what I wrote about in that last book up there, Cherokee Odyssey. Very violent, bloody war. And immediately after it is over, South Carolina government is interested in putting new settlers right on the edge of that border. And so what Galphin and his business partners will do is get this huge tract of land. They will carve out 4 townships with exclusivity for Scots-Irish immigrants only, preference for large families. They get South Carolina government to give them a 10-year exemption on taxes. That would have worked for me. And bring them into the backcountry. Notice the names that Galphin and his planners came up for these 4 Scots-Irish communities. Boonesboro, named for South Carolina Governor Boone. Belfast, which was the community on Creek and Rayleigh's Creek. Hillsboro, which was the name of the superintendent, the Secretary of State for the Southern Department. By the way, that is how the British government listed the American colonies. They were under the supervision of the Southern Department because we were south from Britain. And so it's interesting that South is used in that name. So Hillsboro is the one on Little River, and Londonboro is the name on Hard Labor Creek community. So exclusivity for Scots-Irish to be opened up to other settlers after a period in which only Scots-Irish could apply for these. And since these people thought they could prosper anywhere in the world, and the harder the circumstances, the better, I wonder what South Carolina government is planting them right there for. What do you wonder? Why is South Carolina government planting them here when the Cherokees start right here? So what are they put in that place for? They are a buffer zone. They are to take the first blows if there is a follow-up war with the Cherokees. To a varying degree, they probably knew somewhat how precarious their position was being located on the Cherokee border, but it did not stop them. They do come in and take these lands. By this time, Galphin is a regular employee of the South Carolina government on regular meetings with the Creeks, and he actually mediated one here in Augusta in November 1763, in which tribes turned over their lands for even more settlement. This got Galphin to thinking that if a Scots-Irish community was okay with local government, if it served the benefits of both the settlers and South Carolina government, why not start a similar plan in Georgia? And so he will come out of this plan in 1761. He will give it about 7 years, and by 1768, he is working on a plan to bring the Scots-Irish into Georgia. They negotiated the same deal. This community, and by the way, one of the things I argue in the book was that George Galphin always managed, in with his philanthropy, he always managed a little bit of profit. So he is going to buy a large tract of land near the proposed Scots-Irish community in Georgia. And eventually I'll get there. So we know this second land is going to be near where Louisville is now. But notice from his base at Silver Bluff, which is where he started out. So Aiken, this is you. His primary base is at Silver Bluff. He will establish a second base near the modern town of Louisville. It was called Galphin's Old Town, or sometimes just Galphinton. And this is the Creek town that he has been assigned to serve both as trader and diplomat for. So he's very smart in that this is an established trade path from the Augusta area down through this region. This is already a well-traveled path by Indians. And so it means there will be customers. It means that he can go from Silver Bluff to Galphin's Old Town, and he will conduct trade and diplomatic business from both locations, all the way down into what is now eastern Alabama. And Greg talked about Governor Wright just a bit. Galphin's partnership with Governor Wright is what made this possible. The governor was very keen to agree to this new Scots-Irish community that was going to be where modern Louisville is now. And one of the reasons Governor Wright wanted to plant these communities here was that it would put them very close to the Muskogee Creek border in Georgia. In fact, of all of Georgia's settlers, nobody would be closer to the Creek border than the Scots-Irish community he was going to plant in Louisville. And again, I think we know why they're there, right? They are to be the buffer zone for an attack from the Muskogee Creeks, if that comes. This is what's left of Galphin's Old Town, right outside of Louisville on Highway 17. So this is that other base of operation that he will use. He purchased 1,500 acres here. He filled it with cattle and other livestock. He was going to loan the new settlers that he brought over here this livestock until such time as they could purchase their own. Wonder who they'd be purchasing that from? George Galphin. Yeah, so he was always the businessman. He is a perfect marriage of patriotism and profit, philanthropy and profit. He manages somehow to do both. And so his partnership with Governor Wright will not last forever, as we know. The two men will take two different sides. When George Galphin began to advertise for this new Scots-Irish community, as we said, near where Louisville is now, Governor Wright picked the name Queensboro. That was his choice of name. And when George Galphin and John Ray advertised for settlers back home, they will get plenty of people. They advertised that Georgia and the South in general was just a rich place where people of even modest industry and fortitude could make a fortune. And what he has amassed by the end of his life will give testament to that. And we're jumping ahead a little bit, but by his death, a 40,000 acre holding of land. He was a large slave owner of 128 slaves. And he had relationships with some of the women slaves who were his common law wives. He has daughters by them. So it is, for someone who comes here with nothing, the ending story of this is huge. But Queensboro is settled by around 1772. It is in place. They did not get it. They wanted male heads of households with large families, and they ended up letting virtually anybody from Northern Ireland in. One of the largest families that came over was Isabella Irwin and her 8 daughters. So not a man in the crowd, but all let in, all planted in Queensboro. And the Queensboro folks are planted just before the American Revolution. And so their lives are going to be somewhat problematic as they are on the Creek border. So I know you all came to hear a little bit about Galphin and the revolutionary career, so let's get into that. George Galphin had been constrained as a trader working for the British government. There were certain trade rules he had to follow. For example, he was forbidden from arranging transfer of land between the tribes and any private individual. He was not supposed to sell alcohol to the tribes. There were other trade restrictions that none of the fur traders liked. And so when the war started, Galphin was one of many Scots-Irish traders who decided the Patriot side would suit him much better. He envisioned that he would not be bound with all these restrictions. And as we said, as he told Patriot leaders, and he corresponded with Governor Henry Laurens of South Carolina quite a bit, he told Governor Laurens, "I should take a pleasure in serving my country." And so he makes that choice fairly early in the conflict. So he gets Queensboro settled. He gets a settlement going in Queensboro. And by 1775, he has made his choice to go with the Patriots. And one of the ways we know how influential he had become, he gets tapped by the new Patriot government to become a Continental Indian Commissioner for a new Patriot Indian agency in the South. It was the largest between the Northern District, the Middle District, and the Southern District, the Patriot Indian agents. The Southern District had the largest. He was one of 5 Continental Indian Commissioners. And one of the reasons that the Patriot government picked him was 20 years experience in the backcountry. He's got Indian family connections. He has very close ties to leaders in these principal towns, these very important, influential towns like Casita and Coweta. And like I said, the Southern Indian Department for the Patriots is the largest. One of the enemies he will fight with in this period, is the head of the British Indian Superintendency, John Stuart. John Stuart is a Scot, and George Galphin is Scots-Irish. So in the course of the war that is coming, the Patriots ask George Galphin to keep the Creeks neutral in the war. And the way the Creek Confederacy works is if there is not unanimous agreement between the lower Creeks, which is where Galphin is assigned, if there is not unanimous opinion between the lower Creeks and the upper Creeks, then the Confederacy cannot make war. It cannot go to war. And so his job was to keep the lower Creeks neutral, out of the conflict. At a later point, possibly bring them into the conflict on the Patriot side. And that is a big decision that both the British and the Patriots made. They first tell the tribes, stay out of the war, this is not your business. But they will eventually bring them into the war with not good results for the tribes, I'm afraid. So some of the highlights from this career. To keep the tribes loyal, he had to introduce a certain amount of propaganda into the war and the conflict. For example, the Patriot Indian agents like Galphin told them that the whole war was to stop the British from withdrawing the trade. That was what the entire revolution about. So the British Indian agents like John Stuart would say, the whole war is about stopping the Americans from stealing all your land. That's the only thing the revolution is about. So both sides are going to lie to the tribes and tell them oversimplified stories. One of the biggest missions that George Galphin undertook in the war was to take a group of Muskogee Creek leaders. He had offered them a tour of Philadelphia, where the Patriot government was housed. And he was dismayed at first that none of the tribes, none of the leaders, including his very close friend, his father-in-law, handsome fellow, none of them were interested. And for a moment, he took that as a sign that they were maybe changing allegiances or not loyal to the Patriots. And then he found out they wanted to go to Charlestown, not Philadelphia. Philadelphia was some abstract place that they hear about. They knew Charlestown. People had gone to Charlestown. So he arranges this grand tour of Charlestown in July of 1777. The tribal leaders were given a military parade, and they were presented to the governor and council. Galphin particularly took them on board the French warships in the harbor to impress upon them the fact that the French were about to come into the war and help the United States. He was always trying to impress the tribes that Britain was this failing power and about to fall away, and so no reason to trust Britain. The war proved dangerous for Galphin, but he garnered a tremendous amount of praise for his efforts. And some slides are easier to find than others. He gets direct praise from the government at Charlestown and Governor Henry Laurens. After the very successful tour of taking the Muskogee Creeks to Charlestown, the Gazette of the state of South Carolina covered the event and praised Galphin, this immigrant, for doing this incredible work. They called him a gentleman and praised his work in not only touring the Creek delegates, but making sure there was no trouble with them while they were in Charlestown. Tremendous praise. And he pays a price for this. He pays a price for this, and it gives us a sense of how dangerous his job was. The minute he became successful in negotiating the Creeks through this conflict, loyalist Indian agents, particularly John Stuart, began to target him. John Stuart put a bounty on his head for his death. And out of Florida, the Loyalists began to bring the Florida Rangers up from Florida for attacks on either his base at Silver Bluff or his base at Galphin's Old Town. And there were always strangers waiting just outside the gates of either place. And so, in a very unusual move, I think Governor Laurens actually spoke to Galphin and said, "Do you want me to assign armies? Do you want troops to protect you?" And Galphin said, "No, I'm going to use my men patrol the estates. I've armed my men." You know who he's talking about? His male slaves. He has armed his male slaves. He trusts them that much. And I think we all know slavery is an immoral evil. Galphin, like most Scots-Irish, accepted it. He encouraged the people that came into the backcountry on the Scots-Irish network to get a slave once you get here. But he trusts his male slaves. He turns down militia support from Governor Laurens, saying, "My men can protect me better than your men." And so there is a trust element there. In regular correspondence with Governor Laurens, Greg talked a moment ago about complaining Governor Wright. George Galphin always complains to Governor Laurens about how much in danger he is, how much a strain this is. He told the governor, "I would be okay if it were not for these damn villains on the frontier that want to shoot me," spelled S-H-U-T-E. They want to shoot me. And so he has his own slaves as guards around both outposts. Governor Laurens, by 1778, is aware that Galphin has done this tremendous service to the Patriot cause by keeping the Creek Confederacy. And you know a little bit about the mechanics of this. He has kept them out of the war. And when the French come into the war in 1778, the Indian threat just goes away. It is no longer perceived as a major threat to the Patriots' success. One of the things that the Patriots feared, and as a Native American historian, not heritage, my Ancestry and Me test proved that. Plenty of Scots, Irish, and Welsh, but no Native American. The fear that the Patriots had were that the Cherokees and the Creeks would link up together and attack the backcountry at a time when the British attacked from the coast, and the entire revolutionary effort would be destroyed in that way. That was never going to happen because the Creeks and Cherokees were themselves enemies. They were not compatible in many ways. That was never going to happen, but the Patriots thought it was going to happen. So the fear of it becomes more important than the reality that it was not going to happen. But Galphin kept the Creeks out of the war until the French entered the war, and then it really didn't matter what the Southeastern Indians did from that point on. But I wanted to share with you what Governor Lawrence said about Galphin. I hold the states of South Carolina and Georgia, as well as the United States, much indebted to your unwearied labors for the present good disposition of those savages and their continuance in this temper. It depends much upon your exertions, so we are all bound to pray for your life and health. So a leading mover and shaker in this recognized what George Galphin did for the moment. The enemy got very close. On one occasion, a group of Florida Rangers was waiting outside of the Silver Bluff base. One of Galphin's employees, a man named Captain John Gerard, looked a lot like Galphin. And so Gerard was taking this delegation out of Silver Bluff, and the Florida Rangers attacked and killed him, thinking they had killed Galphin, but they had not. And George Galphin even told Henry Lawrence how much it was heavy on his heart this man was killed because others thought, it was him. But he spoke about this. Galphin did not live to see the end of the war. He died in 1780, and we know the war drags on a little longer. But his enemy, John Stuart, died around the same time, the man who was in charge of the British Indian Agency. And so both of these men sort of die off around the same time. And that maybe gives me 5 minutes to talk about this unusual family that George Galphin leaves behind. You would think he had no time for anything else. However, there are 5 common law wives that would beg to differ with you. And remember, we're talking about a 40,000 acre estate to be divided up among the offspring, over 128 slaves to be divided up. Some of them will be freed. Some of Galphin's daughters are freed. But I just want to briefly mention the relatives from the relationship with a French woman named Rachel Dupree. We have Thomas and Martha. These are the children, and Mr. Murray told me before we met that they are still school age at the time of his death. And remember, Thomas, the son, his name Thomas, was also Galphin's father's name. Martha was one of his sisters, and so he reuses their names. We have children from Indian women. Matani is one of these women, 3 children, one of them named George after him. We have an Indian woman named Nichucky, children by her. We have children from an enslaved woman named Sappho, daughters Betsy and Rachel, and then from an enslaved woman named Mina, another enslaved daughter. Now, what I'll say in closing is you would sort of expect him to use racial ideas to leave estates, like African American children get nothing, Native American children get nothing, Caucasian children get everything, that sort of mixture. It's kind of ironic. Galphin leaves in the will, he leaves it more based on gender. The male children get the biggest sections of land, whether they are Caucasian or Native American. They get huge chunks of land. They get sawmills, grist mills. The daughters, again, they get houses in town. They get smaller amounts of land. They get money and furniture. All of them got slaves. And this is the sad thing, part of working in Southern history, as we look at these wills, and the Galphin will is in the South Carolina Library. in Colombia. It is a fascinating document in and of itself. I want to focus on the African American daughters for just a second in closing. So Rachel and Betsy were from one mother, and then Barbara was the daughter of Mina, another enslaved woman. And notice Barbara is his mother's name. Betsy, from the relationship with Sappho, Betsy died before her father. Rachel outlived him. On the day he freed her, when this will was made public, he freed her and gave her slaves. So wrap your brain around that. Same thing with the other daughter. On the day they are freed, they become slave owners. So this is how complicated backcountry life is. This is how complicated Creole society is. And just to show you how savvy Galphin was, he insisted in the will that when slaves were purchased for the two black daughters who are now free, and again, you get your freedom in one day and you become a slave owner that same day. The instructions were that the slaves were to be bought from people that had never known either daughter as a slave. Why did he do that? What do you think? He did not want the slaves to have an air of familiarity about his daughters. He wanted them to be looked up to, respected, feared. He did not want someone that knew them casually before when everybody was a slave. So a special purchase made of people. Some of the enslaved Galphin people, as many people in the room already know, some of the enslaved people from the Galphin estate will form a church called Silver Bluff Baptist Church at first, later Springfield Baptist Church, oldest in the area. And so this family, from one person who comes from Northern Ireland, touches so many aspects of backcountry life, started so many families in different directions, started so many institutions in different directions. So after rambling a bit, I will stop here and maybe take a few questions. I don't want to infringe on Leanne's time.
When did the stockade and Silver Bluff disappear? How active was it after he died?
Not very. The Savannah River Archaeological Site has most of the information on that. And years ago, when I tried to get access to see a little bit about what they had, I felt like I was dealing with Fort Knox. Very, very hard just to see their leftover trade items. But when the British come into the area, that pretty much neutralizes Silver Bluff.
So these wives, common law wives, they were not serial, right? They weren't one after another. They were all at the same time.
Pretty much, pretty much. Now,
pretty spread out around the territory.
In the will, Galphin left 50 pounds sterling to every widow that lived within 30 miles of Silver Bluff. So I sometimes wonder if that was generosity or payment, maybe, for other services. But and he also left money. In the event that all of his children were to have died, everything would have gone to his sisters back in Northern Ireland. Mr. Murray?
One thing that I felt fascinating about will, which is a 23-page handwritten document, when you look at slaves during that period of time, they were not really, not in Galphin's case, but they were considered property. And property, they were more valuable than land. And a lot of times, their names were not represented anywhere.
And they are in that will.
But in Galphin's will, he listed all of these slaves by their name, and I created a list of all of these names, and I just think it's fascinating because if a person has a name, they are a human being, and that's so very, very important. And something else that was very fascinating, in 1791 through 1793, there was the Baptist National Register that had interviews with people, and you had several of Galphin's slaves were actually interviewed, as well as George Lyle, who was the really America's first missionary who was allowed to preach on the Galphin plantation. And I mean, it's details about what went on there and dated back to then. I mean, so that's fascinating.
I see him, and I told Mr. Murray this before we started, I see him as a Daniel Boone type figure for this area. He's not on the level of George Washington. He's not that kind of player. He's not an Alexander Hamilton, but he is definitely a Daniel Boone type figure for this area.
What happened to the daughters who were freed?
They had estates in town, or they had homes in town. They were given furniture, money, livestock. So he set them up. I'm sure marriage was a part of that, but that goes beyond my scope.
What was the attitude toward these children, these mixed heritage children, as far as the other Indian tribes and also the other white settlers? Because in popular culture, it's always.
Here in the South, the mixed blood children among the tribes were called mixed bloods or breeds for half breeds, which is not particularly complimentary. I think, oh, sorry. Here in the South, the Anglo-Indian children were called mixed bloods or breeds, half-breeds, not very good names, where the French have names for them like the métis and the Spanish have names for them like mestizo. So the only thing I can fathom is that Scots-Irish had a different take on racial matters. Like Mr. Murray said, he lists all the names. They are listed by name, names like Morcha and Elsie. And, if you would think maybe there would be more prejudice with the daughters, but to set them up as business women, free them, give them slaves, he obviously sees them differently. And again, that's the complexity of human nature that Greg mentioned in his earlier talk, I think. When I looked through his correspondence, I could not see any desire on his part to end slavery. I never saw it as a horrible evil. He just said, if you get off the boat here and you have any money, get a slave. Life will be easier for you. But I never saw any defense of slavery in his writings either. So I saw neither defense of it nor condemnation of it. He seems to accept it as, over here, this is just a way of life.
Why were the deer skins so valuable?
They could be taken back to Europe and converted to leather and used in military uniforms and other uses. For about a 50-year period, it provided more wealth than almost any other startup business for somebody with low education, like the fur traders had usually.
Black offspring or the mixed breeds, they were also given slaves.
Yes, the Indian children were given slaves. That I don't know. That's a great question. I do know that the Indian and African American children were given more slaves than the white children. And that's unusual. Eric?
So, regarding the skins, were they all deer skins? Were there other kinds of skins? And was there a difference in the value of one type of skin and another type of skin?
It was.
You listed how much you got for different things. Is that all deer skins?
It is. It is all deer skins. That's the preferred thing.
Kind of amazing. I've seen some of the shipping companies from Augusta
It is the startup fortune that jumpstarts other economies. Huh? Too bad. Yes, yes. Some of the tribes actually depleted their deer populations by participating in this trade. Thank you so much